Decision making is not a uniquely human task. Other primates certainly have to make decisions, and in fact animals of all kinds. They have to decide whether to fight or run, and so on. But human decisions tend to be more complex. Therefore, it's unlikely that a particular part of the brain makes decisions. More likely, perhaps, is that areas in the frontal cortex control basic decision-making processes that have been evolved through earlier species. One idea about decision-making is that it's rational, and that we simply figure out the utility of a decision by looking at the value of an outcome and multiplying it by the probability of the occurrence of that outcome. This is known as expected utility theory and is used by economists to predict how decisions should be made. So each course of action is evaluated by multiplying the utility of each outcome, which we can call u of x, by its probability of occurrence, p of x. And then once all the utilities have been figured out, the person can simply decide to choose the course of action that has the highest expected utility. Now this approach works well with well-defined numerical values of probability and utility of outcomes, but in real life, of course, there is often a great deal of uncertainty about what probabilities or values should be assigned to different outcomes. There are a number of departures from expected utility, and one example would be risk-averse people who prefer certain gains to the possibility of losses. So a risk-averse person might prefer to have $100 rather than have a good chance of receiving $200 but a small chance of receiving no money at all. On the other hand, a risk-seeking person might be interested in taking gambles even though the odds are stacked against them, because they're interested in the possibility of a big payoff. So loss aversion occurs when people are risk averse, and risk seeking occurs when people are willing to accept a low probability of a high outcome. Another departure from expected utility is called the endowment effect. And this is where people think that objects are more valuable when they have been in their possession. That somehow just by owning or possessing an object, it becomes more valuable. And therefore they won't part with it unless it has a higher price than what they originally paid for it. This again is not exactly rational behavior according to economic theory, but it has been demonstrated in the research lab. Another interesting area of decision making is what happens when people have unfair deals. In one game called the Ultimate Game that has been studied in research, the first player is a proposer who receives a sum of money and then proposes how to divide the sum between himself or herself and another player. The second player, called the responder, then chooses to either accept or reject this proposal. So what happens here is that instead of doing what might seem rational, which is always accepting whatever amount of money is given by the proposer on the grounds that it's better than nothing, people in fact choose to respond on the basis of whether they perceive the proposal to be fair or unfair. And if the proposal is deemed to be unfair, then the person accepts nothing rather than rewarding the other player who made the unfair proposal. So even though this game is usually played only once, so there's no possibility of reciprocity or of one player paying the other back by giving them the chance to make an unfair proposal so that both players do well, what happens is that people would rather punish an unfair player than receive a small amount of money themselves in an unfair situation. And if we look at the brain, we can see very clear differences between fair and unfair proposals. In the case of a fair proposal, the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is active and the person is making a rational judgment about the value of the proposal. In the case of an unfair proposal, the anterior cingulate cortex is active, indicating a conflict or a departure from expectation, and both sides of the insula are involved, the right and left, indicating something associated with visceral disgust, and the idea that the unfairness of the proposal is disgusting that person. So just by scanning the brain, we can predict how a person is going to respond to a proposal based on whether they perceive it to be fair or unfair, with unfair proposals being stimulating different parts of the brain to make the judgment. We can also look at how decisions are made by studying monkeys, and this allows us to do single cell electrode recordings and get a very fine-grained analysis of what is going on. And given that the basic operations are likely to be similar to human, it gives us insight into likely human behavior when making decisions. In one experiment that was carried out, a monkey was taught to perform a task, and if the monkey got the task correct, then it would receive a sip of orange juice, which was of value to the monkey. And in one particular version of the task, there was an eye movement that the monkey had to make with a cueing arrow. And 20% of the time, the cue would be wrong, and 80% of the time, the cue would be right. And what happened in this situation was when they recorded different cells in the lateral inferior parietal region, they found that some neurons would be sensitive to the probability of reward. So they would fire much more actively when there was an 80% probability indicated by the prime than when there was a 20% probability. On the other hand, other neurons in a similar region responded to the value of the reward, in this case the amount of orange juice. So clearly, even at the basic neuronal level, the utility of a decision was being calculated in the monkey's brain with both the value of the outcome and the probability of the outcome being considered. And it's almost certain that similar kinds of neurons exist in the similar region of the human brain, giving us the basic components for making decisions. In summary, decision-making involves the values that we assign to outcomes, and these values have to be balanced against the probability of those outcomes. Effects such as the endowment effect and loss aversion show that people don't always follow the expected utility model. One important aspect of decision-making is that people have emotional reactions to decision options, and this affects how they process decision outcomes. For instance, unfair offers are processed in different parts of the brain than are fair offers and lead to different types of response. In addition, research with monkeys has identified areas in the lateral inferior parietal cortex that are involved in assessing probabilities and values associated with decision outcomes, showing us the basic decision-making process at work in the brain.